Welcome to the Wisdom of Jacob's Ladder. I'm your host, Jacob Cooper, best-selling author of Life After Breath and the Wisdom of Jacob's Ladder. It's a pleasure having you join us here today. For those of you listening on YouTube, please make sure to check out some of my other videos. Hit that subscribe button, hit that bell notification icon so you can get up-to-date notifications of all my interview releases and video releases. Today's guest is a dear friend of mine, and his name is Bob Ginsberg. For those of you who don't know, Bob is the founder of the Forever Family Foundation, and he will be sharing his incredible journey. A little bit about Bob. Bob Ginsberg started researching the evidence for survival of consciousness soon after his daughter died in 2002. Devastated by the loss, he needed signs to tell him if she still existed in some form. In 2004, Bob and his wife Phran founded the Forever Family Foundation, a global not-for-profit that educates the public about evidence that we are more than our physical bodies. Bob hosts the Signs of Life radio show, is the past editor of Signs of Life magazine, heads the foundation's Medium Evaluation Certificate program, writes a blog at beyondthefivesenses.com, and is the author of 2 books, The Medium Explosion and My Life Here and There, that recently just came out. Bob, Phran, and the foundation are currently featured in the Netflix documentary series called Surviving Death. Sadly, Phran passed to the spirit realm in September of 2020, but her spirit is still very much strong within the foundation and so many others who knew her an incredible impact. It is my honor to have Bob here on the show. I've known Bob personally through presenting through the Forever Family Foundation as the first ever near-death experiencer to present at one of their retreats. And I really know you're going to learn a lot from Bob as he's able to really give the science behind the stuff, demystification of it, share a lot of his grief journey, talk about the foundation, and just really discuss any insights that he's had from, the thousands of people who are going through grief and how they could move through their journey from firsthand experience, as well as being the co-founder and, the heads of the Forever Family Foundation. Bob Ginsberg, thank you for joining the Wisdom of Jacob's Ladder. Great to have you today. How are you doing?
I'm doing good. It's always my pleasure to be with you, Jake. Thanks.
For audience members who may not know, I know we go, way back. I know I met you at the retreat, for the Forever Family Foundation. And I was just so touched as a presenter, but also I felt like a participant on that, just to see the transformation of your beautiful work with the foundation. It's hard to separate Bob Ginsberg and the Forever Family Foundation because the two to me are similar, but on this channel, we really like to kind of know the why and the foundation. So take us through on your process and how you kind of came to this position, because I bet if I had come to you 40, 50 years ago and say, hey, Bob, you're going to be doing this, you may have thought so. So just kind of tell us your bit of your story and background.
Yeah, it's really, it's interesting. I mean, you know me only because of the work for a Family Foundation, but 20 years ago, I was a completely different person, especially in my views and my beliefs. If we were having this conversation, let's say 21, 22 years ago, I would have said that you're woo-woo nuts, because
right.
I was a very logical left brain thinker. I wasn't very spiritual. I didn't give much thought to life after death, simply because I thought that we are our brains, and when our brains die and are no more, we're no more, and death was final, and so forth. So, fortunately, I wasn't a closed-minded skeptic. I was open-minded to things. I just didn't see, how anything was possible. What was interesting is that I clearly remember about a couple of months before my daughter died in a car accident, that I was playing golf with a friend of mine, and golf course was crowded, and we were sitting in the car together waiting to tee off at the next hole. And my friend Kenny, he had just lost his wife to cancer. And he looked at me and he said, "Bob, I have to tell you something." And I said, "What?" And he said, "I went to a medium."
Mm.
And I said, like alarm bells started. I wasn't quite sure what a medium was, but
A large or a small or extra small. Yeah.
I wasn't sure, but I said, okay. And then he goes, and Bob, she was telling me all of these pieces of information that nobody knew, and it was so obscure. And there's no way she could have known it. So I really believe that I was talking, with my wife. And I just gave him one of those looks like people give me now. and,
Right.
and I just said something lame like, "Well, who knows, Kenny." And I remember going home and to my wife, Phran, and saying, "Look, I'm so worried about Kenny. He's overwhelmed by his grief. He's going to this gypsy fortune teller, and she's going to take all his money. And
Yeah.
look at my life now. Bears forward." So, listen. There are different ways of getting to knowledge of a greater reality. I mean, one is obviously the path that you took. You were somewhat of a spiritual person, but you had this incredible, near-death experience, when you were very young, which really changed the way you think about death. And other people take a different path. And for me, it took years and years, even after we formed the foundation, where I would relent, because I took the science route, and I had to know whether there were credible people that had any evidence that was significant, that we survived, bodily death. And then eventually, I relented because I was smart enough to say, this is too big to ignore, at all. And I was fortunate in that my wife, Phran, was very intuitive and had all these experiences. And after my daughter passed, I felt relieved and comforted by these contacts that she was having, because I knew that she would never lie to me, and she wasn't making this stuff up. So she was like my lifeline, dragging me through my grief, even though I was fighting it every step of the way. So, that's the route that I took. And I think those are the two things. I mean, you can have, it doesn't have to be an NDE, but you can have other types of profound experiences, whether it be dream visitations or could even be an incredible, medium reading or a vision, and you just know it in your heart and you don't question it anymore. I've had some of those experiences, but they didn't come from me until after I learned to accept them, not only accept them, but notice them, because there were things that were happening all around me that I just didn't fit within my reasoning or my consciousness. Yeah. So I just ignored it. So science, it opened me up to accept personal experiences.
My question for you, I mean, it's easy for me, right? Because I had this near-death experience, and that just blew my mind, and subsequent out-of-body experiences. I know, from hearing you speak, correct me if I'm wrong, but a big emphasis of the foundation is, the transition from hope to belief to faith to a knowing, just that trajectory. I'm wondering for you, is there any particular stories, that transformed, because it seems like you have this knowing now. Is there like a couple different things you could point to that transformed that faith into this hard, knowing that you have today? Is that the case that, today?
Yeah, for me, it was more of an accumulation of things. It wasn't like one thing, but there were many things that, I mean, obviously, it started, and this story, but Phran, my wife, woke up at 3:00 in the morning, on September 1st, 2002. And she was trembling and shaking. And I said, "What's the matter? What's the matter?" And she couldn't even talk. She just stared at me. And I said, "What's the matter?"
Wow.
And she said to me, "Something horrible was going to happen today." And I said, what does that mean? She said, "I don't know, but all I can tell you is that our lives are going to be changed, forever today." And
Wow.
I won't go into all the details, but I took it seriously. And the reason I took it seriously, even though I didn't believe in visions or precognitive experiences and premonitions and things like that, but we had been married, for decades, and Phran had many experiences where she had these visions, and every single time they played out exactly the way she said. They were all good things that happened to us, but logic told me if she was right then, she could be right now. And I watched over my 3 children throughout the day, and then in the evening, I let my guard down, and then it faded, from my awareness. And my son and my daughter were in a car crash, and my daughter didn't survive her injuries, and my son had very significant injuries, was in a coma, and eventually recovered. But so that was the stimulus that I'd call it an obsession. I had to find out how she knew, because I knew she knew. I saw her. She was shaking. She told me our lives were going to be changed. So I started going across the country and meeting with scientists and researchers and medical doctors that studied consciousness. And the more I learned, the more hopeful that I got. I was also amazed that very few people were aware of all the evidence that I was learning. So that was the first thing that opened me up. I clearly remember stories at the very beginning that I dismissed. I found out that my daughter, she passed when she was 15, but when she was 12 or 13, she made her best friend enter into a pact with her. And that pact was, if either one of them were to die, they would each make up a sign that so the other one would know that they still existed, because they would communicate that sign to their friend from the other side. Like, what 12-year-old does that, but my daughter did. And I found out, I didn't know this till much later on, but after the funeral, my daughter's best friend came to the house and told my wife about this pact. And my daughter's sign was that she was going to take a blue magic marker and put it in an unusual place. And her best friend said she came home from the funeral and she walked into her bedroom, and neatly placed on her computer keyboard was this blue magic marker. And she told Phran that she didn't own one. She hadn't used one, forever. And then she went around to the other members of the household and asked if anybody else had been in her room, and they all said no. So there's an incredible experience that I totally dismissed. I said, this is, this is just a coincidence. But these things kept happening more and more and more and more, and it reached a point where I couldn't dismiss them anymore. I mean, I was also getting dream visitations from my daughter. Over the course of, I would journal them because Phran told me to do so. And over the course of, I think, a 3-year period, I had 74 visitations. And in each one, which when I talk about dreams, I talk about the difference between a regular dream, which is usually a rehashing of events that happen in your life, and it's kind of disjointed and it doesn't make much sense, and you forget it as soon as you wake up. Whereas in a visitation, it's like tactile. You could talk to your loved one, you could kiss them, you could hug them, you could have a conversation, and you remember them. So I was fortunate to have so many of these, and that was comforting. I won't say that it was early on, so it still didn't get me to that knowing stage that you talked about. But all these were steps along the way, and I conducted my own experiments with remote viewing. things that I controlled and I didn't read about them in books, and research and just, one day I just relented. I said, no, it can't be a coincidence.
Wow. And this is a sensitive topic because in our life, we don't prepare ourselves to have a child cross over before we do. That's not something that we intend. But when I take a step back and I look at you and Phran, it just seems like the ultimate yin and yang, and your DNA is so immersed in the Forever Family Foundation. Taking a step back, do you feel that you and Phran were kind of put on this earth for like a play? Do you feel like there was a kind of like a blueprint for this before you got here at all? Is that,
Well,
you know,
I can tell you that Fran certainly did. Absolutely.
is that
I mean,
something that yeah,
she thought her whole life was in preparation, for this. I mean,
right.
even to the point of getting her MBA, so she would be able to run an organization, successfully. Or we bought this huge house, which turned out to be a meeting place for scientists and guests and everything that we would bring in and spend time with. And so she thought just what you're saying, that this
She
was
felt guided,
guided,
and like in the pre-life planning phase and all that.
yeah. I mean, she believed it, and I didn't necessarily. I was open to it. I can't say that I definitely shared that view, but yes, she certainly did. And listen, I would gladly turn back the clock and give back everything,
Yes.
to have like 5 more minutes with
That's what any parent, that I talk to would say. No matter what, you would trade it all to have your child back in the physical. Sure.
Yeah. You know what, Jake, and this is something that you could relate to, but it took me many, many years to realize, and it's sort of the great irony of life, in that everything that we can perceive with our physical senses is temporary. We live under this illusion of permanence, but our bodies are temporary. This desk that I'm sitting at is temporary. The floor beneath me is temporary. You could even make the argument that the earth that's spinning, is temporary. But the things that remain invisible to us are permanent. Our consciousness is permanent. Our thoughts, our love, our compassion, that's where our loved ones are, a true home. It's like a contradiction in terms. It's hard to grasp that concept, but it took me a long time to do that. But where they are, is the true home, and that's where permanence exists. And I try to live my life now that way, knowing that everything that surrounds me is just temporary. I mean, enjoy them and deal with them and react to them as they occur, but don't delude yourself by thinking it's always going to be like that, And I find that helpful in the grief process, if I can keep reminding myself of that.
Right. I mean, because you're someone who seems very grounded. And so for viewers who have all these, beliefs, is it okay to grieve too? Could two things coexist where you could have a strong faith in this, but you could also be very human and grieve too? Is that okay? Is that a part of this?
Absolutely. I mean, I'm very careful, at the grief retreats and all the work that we do, to tell people this: we don't have a magic pill. I mean, that hole in your heart does not disappear. They were, our loved ones were part of our lives. That part is in this physical world, is gone. And it's okay to grieve, but what we try to do is help people to transform the grief so it changes. It's always going to be there, but if you believe, I mean, it's logic. If you believe that your loved one still exists in some form, that's the only thing, at least for me, that could give me any hope or comfort. Because that knowledge, if I believe I'm going to see them again, and this is just a tiny little blip in a vast continuum of life, I can live my life, differently, and there have been, as you know, I mean, there have been many research papers that have been peer reviewed and published in medical journals that show that those who believe in an afterlife do better in their grieving than those who don't, and that makes perfect sense to me.
Say that one more time. That's a big point.
I mean, those who believe that there is life after physical death do better in their grief than those who don't. I even before we found the foundation, when I was going to grief support groups with Phran, I found people that felt that the very notion, if I would suggest to them that their loved ones still existed, they found that hurtful. And I said, I couldn't figure out why. And then I realized that a lot of people become defined by their grief. That's who they are. It's this happened to me, and and that's I'm doomed, and that's the way it's always going to be. And by suggesting to them that their loved one still exists, in their mind, diminishes the depth of their sorrow and their grief. And I had to learn that lesson, and it was important because I have to understand that. So I understand why people can be so shut out. But I also noticed over the years that all these people that refuse to acknowledge even the possibility, they don't do so well as they live out their physical lives, because they just wallow and they can't climb out of that deep chasm of despair. And this knowledge of, near-death experiences and after-death communications and end-of-life experiences, reincarnation, all these things we talk about, they're tools. So yes, you're going to grieve, but when you hit those low points, you could step back and say, wait, what about this? And what about that? And what about this medium reading I got? And kind of dig yourself out and get back on track. There's always going to be those highs and lows, but being able to bounce back is the key.
Right. It's almost kind of like a courtroom, and you're trying to give different pieces of evidence out there and have each person choose for their own what makes sense out of the many paths up the mountain of eternal awareness. And we divide all these things with different terms, but to me, they're all one and the same. They just allow your mind to have life after life awareness.
It's true. And there are some people, and I'd include you in this. I mean, I know that you're very interested in the science, and so forth, but you don't need the science to tell you what you already know in your heart, and Phran was like that. She had a great respect for the science, and that's part of the foundation, but she didn't need that part of it. I mean, she knew that others did, and that's why the foundation is a convergence of science and spirituality. But I think that's wonderful. It's a true blessing to be able to know this without having to constantly take the path that I did of reinforcement after reinforcement.
Right. Or needing to go through trauma or suffocate, have an NDE that you could have it, in a state where your body isn't just jeopardized. I'm wondering, people watching are very familiar, obviously, with the Surviving Death Netflix documentary and your segment. Many times people look at the surface of things and just that's all that they see. But to take the viewers, and this as a writer, there's a saying called show, don't tell. And to take the readers to kind of show us like the kind of genesis moment of the foundation. Was there a moment that you kind of looked at Phran and said, we may have something? Like what kind of spurred the foundation? What was the genesis of it?
Well, it was really simple. Phran and I were going to as you no surprise to you that our lives were totally devastated, and we were going out of our minds trying to figure out what to do. And I said, I was searching for some support group, because, obviously before the foundation, and I found a support group. It was Compassionate Friends, which is for parents of who had lost children. And I called up Phran. I said, I found this group. It's an hour away, and I'm leaving work, and I'm picking you up, and we're going there. And we sat there, and I was listening, and we went to a second meeting, and then Phran and I already started having an interest in possibility of life after death. And every time that we brought up the subject, the moderator of this particular group would shut us down and say, we don't talk about such things here. The purpose of this group is to teach ways of coping with grief and so forth. And we thought that was very odd, because we found that that's all the parents wanted to talk about,
Wow, yes.
So
Wow.
we used to stand out after the meeting was over. Phran and I would stand in the parking lot in the winter, freezing our asses off, and having another meeting with all these parents and talking. And then we said, there has to be some place where people like this can get together and exchange ideas and experiences without the fear of being judged, and labeled and so forth. So that's where we got the idea for discussion groups. We call them afterlife discussion groups. And one thing led to another, and we were working with, scientists, and we decided to form a foundation to incorporate, all of these things. But the discussion groups were really the backbone of it. And we started it just because we saw a need. And I'd be the first to tell you that for the first 3-4 years after we started the foundation, I didn't do it to help others. I mean, that's obviously changed, but I was just looking for a way to survive my own grief. I was trying to find an outlet for my own grief. And eventually, as I learned more and I started to progress, that of course, I quickly realized that the only thing in my life that gave me any hope or comfort was in helping others that are in a similar situation. Now, I realize, fast forward to the old Bob Ginsberg, like 25 years ago, I would have looked with a skeptical eye at people who said things like that. But it's really true. I mean, when you suffer such trauma as like losing a child, everything that was important to you is no longer important to you. I mean, yeah, I had all the material stuff and all the toys and, and the big house and the cars and all that crap, but it meant nothing. It absolutely nothing. But if I was able to talk to somebody who lost somebody close to them and make a small difference in their lives, I mean, that gave me enormous happiness, I'll call it,
Sure.
So I, that transformed me. And as well as anybody, that for a lot of people, it takes trauma to be a catalyst to exploration. And I think that's absolutely true. It certainly was in my case. If things turned out differently and my kids weren't in that car crash, I'd probably still be a somewhat materialistic, logical thinker who looked askew at discussions like this. So in that way, I transformed.
Yeah, I mean, obviously, when you lose a kid, social dynamics change. How did some of your friends take this changes in you? Did you talk about this openly with your friends too, or you just had to kind of separate synagogue and state? Like, how did that kind of work with your social dynamics?
You mean after we started the foundation?
After the foundation and some of your shifts that you've had and just this kind of focus that you were having, did that sit well with some of your social groups? Or
well, it's funny. This is just me, and I'm certainly not going to recommend it, but I kind of shut down and I lost track with all my friends,
I see.
Others, including Phran, found great comfort, in sharing with friends, whatever. I just wanted to be left alone. So in that respect, I'm not a good example because there wasn't a lot of interaction. However, I was running a business. I mean, I had an insurance agency for 40
Sure.
some odd years, and it was a large agency, and I had a lot of interaction with people over the years, and nobody knew
The side of you.
the side of me,
Yes.
until, one day, just by coincidence, a client happened to, I don't know, see an interview that I was in, and then, of course, after the Netflix thing came, a couple of people said, "Wait, I know that guy. He's my insurance, broker," and that sort of opened the crack. But we were very different in that respect. I mean, if Phran walked into a room and there were other people, she felt an obligation to educate them into what she knew to be true, not to try to convince them, but just to share. And I kind of drew the line, and I always I wasn't like that. Like you said, we were totally opposite, in every way. However, as the years went by, and especially now that Phran has passed, I'm kind of channeling her, and I'm a lot more, I'll talk to anybody, about it, and tell them what I know. There was, and you never know. There's a guy after Phran passed. I joined a golf club that's right near my home, and I played golf by myself. I just wanted to be myself. I don't want to deal with all the crap with other people. But I met another, like member of the club, and just by coincidence, I was sharing a cart with him, and we started talking, and I started telling him about the stuff that I do. And of course, it turns out that he was tremendously interested, and his wife was really into this stuff. And, and so I'm just an example that there's no reason to keep these things in. I mean, what we try to do as a foundation is we try to educate people and to try to tell them that it's not necessary to keep these things in. If we want to change worldview about death, and especially life after death, we have to get people to just simply share what happens to them. I'll give you an example. About 2 years after Bailey, my daughter, passed, I went to see my physician, who happened to be a family friend, and so I used him. And I don't remember why I went. I had some sort of an ailment, and I walked into his office finally, after sitting in the waiting room for like 20 minutes, and then I go in. He says, "Hey, Bob, how are you?" "Fine." He says, "What are you up to these days?" And I said, "Oh, you really want to know?" He said, "Yeah." I said, I'm studying survival of consciousness." And he looked at me and said, "Okay." And then we start talking for another 10, 15 minutes. And he looks at me again. He says, "Can I ask you something?" I said, "What?" He says, "What's survival of consciousness?" So I start telling him about the stuff we're talking about now, how I believe that our mind is different than our brain, and our consciousness survives a bodily death. While we're having this conversation, his nurse walked into the room, and it turned out that his nurse had just lost a child to crib death, an infant, and she was very interested in the conversation. So now we're talking again. There's like a riot going on in his waiting room because we're in there an hour, and he never did ask me why I was there medically. So she finally leaves, the nurse, and then he closes the door and he gets very quiet, and he looks at me. He says, "I have to tell you something." And I said, "What?" And he said, "My father died 7 years ago." And I said, "Yeah." He said, "And he died, at 9:00 in the morning, but I had a lot of critical patients in the hospital, so I had to call my answering service." And I called my answering service, and they said, "Oh, doctor, your father called." And he was like stunned. He said, "My father died at 9:00 this morning." And they said, "Oh, I'm so sorry, doctor. We must have gotten the message wrong. He must have said your father-in-law." And he said, "No, my father-in-law's been dead for 15 years. He said, "What time did the message come in?" They said 9:15. He said, "Read me back the message." And the message was, "Frank, it's me. I'm okay."
Wow.
Now, I like to tell that story because it's an example. Here was a guy, I mean, he's a medical professional. He never told a soul. He never told his wife. He never told his children. He certainly wasn't going to tell a colleague. He wasn't going to tell a friend because he was afraid of being judged or labeled.
Sure.
But after he heard the stuff I was talking about, he knew he was safe and I wasn't going to judge him. And he told me, now, this happened almost 20 years ago, and I can guarantee you that he never told a soul since then. But what a shame, to have like a profound after-death communication like that and feel that you cannot share that with anybody. And that's what we want to change, Why not share it? I mean, sooner or it's the only way you're going to change the way people look at things,
Yeah, and to me, that's just the genesis. Forever family. You're like when I was there, at least, it's a family. Certainly grief is unique to each person, but all people who are part and participants, usually have lost someone and are able to find ways to talk about this stuff openly without judging. And I know for you and for many, it's very important to be careful with who we discuss these things because not everyone is supportive or can understand or has a good relationship with the unknown. But I think what you do is just, to me, being there, it's heaven on earth. It's everyone being able to be themselves, to talk about these things and not, it's like shooting a basketball into an ocean. Like you can't fail at expressing yourself. And that seems like it liberated you. I'm wondering with the Forever Family Foundation, there seems to be like a big method to it. Like when I was there, normal grief retreats, they're just kind of grief, but yours had different groups and different sects of people who had different losses. Like, what's kind of like the brain trust behind the foundation? Like, give us, for viewers, like a little bit of the insight about it.
Yeah, I mean, first of all, the grief retreats were Phran's idea, like everything else, and since we are an organization that combines spirituality and science, we always try to incorporate both elements in everything that we do. So at these grief retreats, we have mediums that have been certified by the foundation, and we have a certification process that we've been doing since 2005, and it's a very rigorous process that involves evaluating the evidence that they bring forth. When I wrote the book, The Medium Explosion, I didn't make a lot of friends in the mediumship community because I stated that I thought that 10 to 15% of all the practicing mediums today cannot do what they claim. And I didn't say that to infer that they were fraudulent. It's just that they have some degree of intuitive ability, as do you and me and everybody else in varying degrees, but not strong enough to the point where they should be doing it, professionally. They're well-meaning, but somebody says to them, "Oh, you should be a medium." Mediumship is difficult because here mediums have to be very careful not to insinuate that they're grief professionals because they're not, but yet they're sitting with very fragile people that are bereaved, and some of them are really teetering that line. Or if you go to get a medium reading and the medium reading is bad, you may walk away saying, "Hey, this is just a crock and there's no such thing," and you're in worse shape than when, before the reading. On the other hand, we've seen the transformative effects that are really evidential and great medium reading can have. We've seen it flip people forever
in front of your eyes. Yeah,
it's sort of like an NDE experience.
Sure.
And it stays with them. So we're very helpful. And so at these retreats, we try to expose people to different modalities. We have a grief professional that's always there. We have metaphysical practitioners. I usually try to give a talk about the evidence, for life after death. People like yourself that have had these profound experiences, and we just want to expose them to everything, and whatever resonates. But what we found over the years, which is why we keep doing them, is that very often we see people that arrive, and you saw this, when they arrive Friday, they could barely talk, some of them, God forbid they smile, that would be, impossible. And then when the weekend is over on Sunday night, these same people are laughing and joking, and there's nothing more wonderful. I mean, obviously not everybody's going to be like that, but even if you change, a couple of lives that way, I mean,
That's what you get. Yeah.
that it's a gift, I mean, there are different terms for it in different religions, but, it's just something that you can't put into words. And so that's why we keep doing those retreats. And it's probably the most important work that we do, because we could see the tangible results, from people.
Yeah, I mean, for therapists like myself and healers out there and other mediums, you see both ends of the spectrum. You see the transformation at the end, but also the heaviness. How do you persevere? Because it's a lot of intensity to take. And if you're on grief all day, it could take a toll. Like, what kind of tips or tools do you use or do you recommend for people who are around the other side of the aisle and supporting those who are grieving? Like, how do you keep your sanity?
Yeah, it's a great question, and something I have to tell you. I mean, I don't put on that front because I'm always trying to interject, some sort of lightness or humor into to break the heaviness. But I have to tell you, Jake, at the end of every retreat, I am emotionally drained, because I'm in their club, I'm in their position. I feel, I'm not a medium, I like to think I'm a compassionate person, somewhat empathic, and I feel the grief, I feel the heaviness. And
right.
We have a closing ceremony, and we'll do 4 retreats a year for 15 years, and I've never failed to cry because even though I tell myself that I'm not going to cry this year, because I get so overwhelmed. So. And then and just to your point, I mean, afterwards I said, it takes a lot to keep doing it. It really does take a lot out of me. And I could see, I mean, look, you're in the same position. I mean, as a therapist, I mean, and you're tremendously empathic and compassionate, even though you're trying to maintain a clinical atmosphere. It has to affect you. I mean, it has to affect, mediums. So I just have to focus on what we were talking about before, the light, how much light, that you could bring and the difference that you could make. And so it's the same thing. I used to always wonder how people could work in hospice. I mean, how could you be constantly surrounded? But there are these incredible experiences that people that work in hospice can tell you. It's a sacred thing to be among, sometimes, to be among people that are making that transition. So I guess it's all the way that you look at it. But I don't, it's an excellent point, because I don't disassociate. I wish I could. I can't.
It certainly sounds, I know it's hard to accept, but it certainly sounds like this is a calling for you when you're able to do something so difficult and persevere. A big emphasis on my channel is kind of like an Eli Wiesel quote, where our why needs to be strong so our what and our how could follow it. And our foundation is our why. At least for me, when I close my eyes, I always go back to those who've watched, I'm Jewish, as we know, but I watched Schindler's List, and I watched the ending when Oskar Schindler breaks down. He said, I could have done more, I could have done more. And that keeps me going, that other person that I could reach. And that just keeps me going every day. For you, when you close your eyes and just kind of get quiet, like, what's your biggest why? Because you're doing a lot. You're helping people in so many ways, and it's a lot of phone calls and emails, and it's a lot. So what's that foundational why? What would you break that down?
I mean, for me now, I mean, everything that I do is really to continue the work of that Phran did. I mean, to me, that's my reason. If it weren't for her, I mean, she even said to me when she was dying, she said, "Look, this is going to be a lot, and just do what you can and just don't worry about it. Even to the point where if I wanted to stop everything, it was okay with her. And then afterwards, I was like, how could I possibly? She started it. This was her life. I must, continue. And fortunately, she laid out the framework for everything. So I'm just plugging in the pieces. I have a tremendous appreciation now for what she used to do. And I have also a tremendous amount of sorrow that I didn't truly understand what she was going through just in the workload and trying to help people. And I used to say, she said, why can't you do this and help me with that? Now, I could never do that. I can't, but now I'm doing all the stuff that she was asking me to help on.
Yeah.
But I have to. But, that's what keeps me going. I can't even entertain the thought of not doing it anymore because a lot of people, would be disappointed. I mean, I don't know what will happen after my time comes, but for now, that is the thing that's keeping me going. I was once being interviewed, and the interviewer was a clinical psychologist, and I told her that I do things to keep myself busy, even things that you might frown upon, like I'll binge watch TV, just because it takes me to another space where I'm not thinking about grief and I'm not thinking about my loss, and I can just immerse myself, or even playing golf by myself, or sitting on the deck and just watching and listening to the birds and things like that, and
you find joy in some of those things when you
I do, and which I never did before. But also it's sort of a release. It's a grief mechanism for me. And afterwards she told me that after we were off the air, she said, I just want to tell you that you're going about your grief all wrong. And I said, why? And she said, because you're not facing your grief, you're looking to avoid it. And I respectfully disagreed. I said, believe me, I face my grief plenty, but I think that there's no wrong and right when you're in grief. I mean, you have to do whatever you need to do to keep you going, and putting one step, in front of the other. And, she disagreed. I don't know what your thoughts would be. I mean, on that, but you probably have your own thoughts.
I am a student of David Kessler from the Elizabeth Kubler-Ross. I don't know him personally, but he's someone that I really listen to. And obviously his journey, he lost, I believe, a son as well. But I like his analogy where he discusses grief as kind of like a river where you don't resist. What you resist persists, and that river will take you where you're meant to go. And losses aren't just new. We've come from thousands and generations of death before us. It's nothing new, but it's in us. We know how to grieve, much like our body knows how to heal at times. And I think it's important just to allow it to unfold. And you're the embodiment that it's possible to turn the most painful circumstance of life, of losing a child in the fashion that it did, and your wife, where you're able to still say, hey, I have a meaning from that pain. I have a purpose. I'd rather have it the other way, but this is the situation at hand. And it seems to me on the surface, you're doing all that you can from the macro and micro to, best manage an unthinkable life situation.
Yeah, I appreciate that. And, I agree. There's one thing that always stuck with me. I have my own views, which I'm too elaborate to get into now, about the universe and planning and randomness and so forth. But one thing that always stuck with me, that I read a book 15 years ago, which was a compilation of wisdom from the great shamans of the world.
Not the wisdom of Jacob's ladder, the other one. Yeah.
Yeah. Well, listen, you echo some of those, obviously. So not because you read them, just because you have that knowledge. But so one of the shamans said that physical life was like being at a football game. He said, if you have ground level seats, you could hear the grunts and see the chaos, and the emotion, and all the sounds. He said, but it's not until you move to the very, very, very top row of the stadium that you see the patterns. And you see how things unfold and why they unfolded.
The tapestry of it all.
Yeah, and I believe that it's very, very hard for us to recognize meaning amidst the chaos while we're in this physical existence. But I do believe that once we move on to the next world, things will become much clearer.
It's possible. Yeah. You've been around, some of the finest, mediums, internationally in the U.S. who are, affiliated with the Forever Family Foundation, including, Kim Russo, Joe Shield, Laura Lynn Jackson, Bobby Alice, all the, wonderful stars and just tremendous at their crafts. From an observer and seeing all these readings, is there anything that you take in mind with what our loved ones, want from us? What are they? What's obviously there's specific messages that they have or signs, but is there some message collectively that you feel they want us to understand to utilize in this life?
Yeah, there's a difference between evidence and wisdom. For the most part, and I'm currently involved in a research study about wisdom, but it's difficult and it's a departure because
it's hard to measure.
Our loved ones in spirit, it seems logical to me that they have one overriding goal, at least initially, and that's to let us know, the ones that they left behind, that they still exist. So how do they do that? The only way that they can do that is to give us specific evidence that only we would recognize. So mediums, which I think about a lot, doing this 20 years, is that very, very rarely do the mediums ever bring up what the afterlife is like. It's all evidence-based. And also, it's hard enough for the medium to receive the information, interpret it, and put it into words in short pieces of evidence. It must be tremendously hard to get a whole lecture about, wisdom and what the afterlife is like. So what I learned from the mediums over the years is that everything is evidence-based. Now, after when we work with mediums, I'll ask them a question at the very beginning. I'll say, what's more important to you? Bringing through the evidence or conveying a message, from your loved one? And some mediums will say, well, I think that the message is the most important. I disagree, because I believe that you can't accept the message unless you're convinced that the medium has your loved one that they're talking to. So first, they have to provide the evidence. After they provide the evidence, so you know that connection is there, then the messages are welcomed and can be...
You need that foundation first, the undeniable proof that they know, hey, you went to so-and-so, you ate this pizza, you have this jewelry in this box and this drawer, so stuff like that, instead of just saying, hey, your aunt died from meatball parm, like everyone in Long Island would raise their hands, so, I don't know. I think that foundation is crucial. Absolutely. Do you get a sense that people should wait, any bit of time before they get a reading from a medium? Is there like a recommendation? And also, how would you recommend people who are looking to connect to mediums to go about that? I mean, what's the best way? Because people ask me all the time, do you have any recommendations? So what would you say to that person who's...
I get asked that a lot, and I wish I had a clear, definitive answer, but you realize that with mediumship, there are no regulatory bodies and requirements. I mean, there are no licensing requirements. There's no continuing education. There are no proficiency standards. There's no monitoring. So tomorrow you could be Jake the medium and start hang out the sign and start charging people a lot of money. So it's very difficult, because the most logical thing would say, well, go to a friend who gives you a recommendation. But one thing I've learned, after witnessing, 1,000 readings over the years, is that just because a connection is made with one person doesn't necessarily mean that you're going to have the same experience by going to that medium. That connection may not happen. So there are certain resources. I mean, obviously, Forever Family Foundation maintains a list of mediums that they've certified. There are scientific organizations like Windbridge, who have strict protocols and evaluate mediums under scientific conditions, and they maintain a list. There are many different books that have been written about mediumship. I mean, there are recommendations. So, I mean, that people can go by that, but just go in with the idea that it's never a guarantee. It's a very fragile process. There has to be some sort of synchronicity between the person in spirit, the medium, and the sitter, the person getting the reading. And if that doesn't resonate, it may or may not happen. The other question that you had about when is the right time, I don't know that there really is a right time or a wrong time. I know that grief very, very early on can be very, very raw. And, you're just focusing on that one person, and the mediums will tell you, most mediums, that it's too early to try to make a connection when you're in that depth of grief. So I would wait, at least, a few months, maybe 6 months before seeking out the services of a medium. Then there's the question of, when is the person in spirit able to communicate with the across dimensions? Because think about it. I mean,
it's a transition from that soul of the
you wake up in a new dimension, and maybe you never even thought that the afterlife existed. So you might be a little bit confused at the start until you get acclimated, and then being asked to pierce that veil and communicate with the physical world, I don't think it's that easy. So, mediums might, people in spirit might not be able to communicate through a medium until a certain amount of time has elapsed. However, I also know from 100 years of research that's taken place, in that there are cases where people communicate minutes after they pass. They start communicating right away. Crisis apparitions and things like that. So I don't think that there's any rule, but so if you feel the need, act upon it. There's also the other part of the coin, where people have a medium reading that's good, and they feel like that medium is a lifeline to their loved one.
Right.
And they treat the medium like a grief therapist, and they want to go twice a month. And I don't think that's good either.
The dependency. Yeah, because I think what people need to remember is, just because, Laura or Kim shows up and your loved one comes through them, does not mean that they decided to come into Chester, Connecticut at 7:00, whatever. And that time, just because that medium was there, that's why they're there. I think they need to remember that they're always around us. The medium is just a delivery. They don't, our loved ones just don't come through that medium. They're always around us. People need to remember that.
Yeah, and here's an interesting question. I once did a survey, and I asked people, would you rather get a communication from your deceased loved one directly or through the services of a medium?
I like that. That's a good one.
And when I posed that question, I fully expected the majority to say directly. I might loved one to communicate with me directly. That wasn't the case. The majority said, I'd rather get the message through a medium, and that through me. And then when I started to probe into that, I realized there were two reasons for that. One, if people get the communication directly, a lot of them said that they wouldn't trust themselves, like that maybe it was their own grief or their own imagination that's making it up. Whereas if the message came through a professional, somebody that does it, for a living, that, they could trust the information. That's one thing. And the other thing that surprised me is that people were fearful, they said, because, we're taught to fear the unknown. If we can't perceive it with our own physical senses, it's kind of woo-woo. And, there are religious overtones and all sorts of phobias that set in. So that fear factor is disturbing, and it's getting better. But it's not, I think, where we have to be. I mean, I recall once being at a grief retreat, and I was sitting and having a private talk with an attendee, and I said, what would it take? What would it take for you to be absolutely convinced that your daughter, it happened when she lost a daughter, was still existed? And she said, you know what, Bob, if I could see my daughter, then I would be convinced. In other words, perceive her with my own physical senses. And years went by, and I saw her at another retreat, maybe 7 or 8 years later, and I remembered. And I had another talk with her, and she came over to me, and she said, I have to tell you something. I said, what? She said, I saw my daughter. I said, really? Yeah, she came. I was in like this twilight, just waking up stage of sleep, and she was standing at the foot of my bed. I said, and what happened? She said, I was scared out of my mind. So I kind of got startled, and then she disappeared. So here's somebody that, desperately wants a direct communication, but yet when the time comes, she was disturbed by it. So that just shows you that we have to overcome, it's nothing abnormal. It's the natural way.
It's that space with how we relate to it. It is what it is, and what we fill that space is how we, how we engage with it. I'm wondering for you, yes, you run the Forever Family Foundation, but like me, you're also strike me as a private guy too. Like, you like your space, but you also have 2 books out there. So, take us through the process of your most recent release, My Life, as well as the Medium Explosion, and what that process was like for you. What did you, get from it, in terms of writing and writing in general? How would you recommend it for someone who might be grieving too?
Yeah, well, for me, it was writing was a secret passion. I mean, I was an English major in college. I wanted to be a journalist. And then as, life turns out, I had to make a living. I didn't want to be an English teacher. And I wound up being in the insurance business my whole life. So, now, when I left, corporate life, I would always keep my hand in it, writing foundation stuff and articles for a magazine and so forth. But now I was able to pursue my true passion of writing. I enjoy it. It's therapy for me. I don't do it, for anybody else really, except that, a lot of writers are told to write about what you know. So obviously, after working with mediums all this time, I know about mediumship and I've experienced a lot. So the Medium Explosion was a book, all about, mediumship, and that was easy to write because I was well versed in the subject matter. I'd like to write a great novel, but maybe that'll be in the future. But my last book, My Life Here and There, was basically a memoir. But I had to figure out, and I've done a lot of interesting shit in my life, Jake. I went to college in the late '60s. I had a lot of experiences,
Talking Timothy Leary stuff, or
all that stuff, and a lot of it is, I think, is funny stuff. A lot of it is, not meant to be funny, because I've had a lot of profound sorrow in my life as well as joy. And I wrote about that, and that was somewhat, therapeutic. But at the same time, I wanted to be able to incorporate what I've learned about what life might be like in the afterlife. And so I don't mind, talking about, but in a twist in the story, I die in a plane crash, which is partly based in fact, because we had I think it was in 2008 or 2009, we had one of our annual conventions planned in Las Vegas, and Phran had one of her premonitions, and in the premonition, I died in a plane crash on the way because we had to take separate flights because I had a business thing to do. And she immediately got on the phone the next morning and canceled all of our arrangements. We lost a lot of money, but
Wow.
she knew better than to go against her vision. So that, was partly based in fact. I also had a close relationship with a famous physicist that we used to talk about certain things, and I fictionalized that character and so forth. And I got to talk about what I think, based upon my reading, the afterlife is like. So it's a memoir, but it's also, a book about the afterlife. So I enjoyed, writing that as well. So,
Yeah.
For me, it's more of I feel good when I'm writing.
It's a catharsis. And for grief too, it's important, I think, to get our emotions into words. It could be very cathartic. And for those watching, you could buy Robert's books, The Medium Explosion and My Life, both on Amazon. They're tremendous books. I've read both of them. I'm wondering for you, someone who's had a transformational experience in life and your viewpoints on the afterlife. I know you've got grandkids. I know you got beautiful kids. You hopefully have decades, here. But how do you view the afterlife? Is that something that you are looking forward to, fearing? You have a better sense of it? Like, what's your personal views, on life after this life for yourself?
Yeah, well, I'm talking now as somebody who spent a good percentage of his life fearful of death.
Mm.
I just could not conceive that we could be extinguished forever. It used to trouble me, I really was troubled by it, and I used to think about death all the time.
That just complete ending. We're not used to not existing or just being a blank space where there's nothing. We can't wrap our heads around that. Yeah.
That's right. I could not just assimilate that, and so like most people, a lot of things that I did were really, to avoid talking about death and trying to do things that would extend my life and so forth. Now I have no fear of death, whatsoever. I'm not anxious, sometimes I feel like I am, but
especially with all the passings, we just want to be there with.
Yeah, exactly. So I was really, it's funny, even with both of my losses, that especially after my daughter passed, I said, what, my grief was so profound that I said, surely I'm going to have a heart attack and die. I said, I can't survive this, and I was totally accepting of that, and kind of welcomed it, not that I was going to do anything to cause it, but that's what I expected to happen. And it didn't, maybe because of all, the stuff that I got into. But now I am in that knowing stage that this is just one small, brief period of that we're meant to experience. And the thought of being reunited with my family again is comforting. So I don't fear death at all. Now, what I fear, especially after my experiences, is I don't fear dying and what comes next. Like everybody else, I don't want to suffer. So I look at when I was, when Dr. Kevorkian came
Mm,
into being,
mhm.
um,
The assisted suicide doctor.
yeah,
Yeah.
I was against that, and I really could not see his point of view. Now I think of him as a hero,
Hmm.
after watching
Hmm.
what I think is, needless suffering and, in pain. I think there are certain circumstances where it's welcomed. And I really envy people that pass in their sleep, and have a
Hmm.
nice, peaceful, passing.
Right,
So
that struggle physically and just the pointlessness or being a vegetable, it's just
yeah,
waste. It just almost seems like wasted money and time. It's just not, you're not even there. Yeah, and that's, yeah, what's the point of it all?
it makes
Yeah.
no sense. But as far as the dying and death, I have no fear, and that's how I live my life. I mean, I try to live my life with the knowledge that this may or may not be my last, day, and
Mm.
um, it's not going to affect the way that I live my life. I no longer do planning. I used to be a planner and map
Mm.
things out. Now I don't plan because plans I know too often, uh, don't materialize based upon free will decisions that we make and what decisions that others make and so forth. And it is what it is, and it'll be what it'll be. And that's the way with my wife was. There are certain things, especially in running the foundation, that I have to plan. I
Mm.
have to plan and make obligations for retreats. But as far as my personal life, I don't make any great plans.
What sounds like, it's a very thrown out term, but that's kind of mindfulness where you're just in the day, in the moment, fully present with your life. And I think that's a beautiful thing. Yes, to segue on that point, it seems like we know the ending, of it all, but regarding, the next kind of turn regarding the Forever Family Foundation, are there any upcoming retreats or projects or kind of concepts brewing, kind of going on for people to know about or
Yeah, we've since Fran's passing, we eliminated certain things in order for me to concentrate more on the things that I know that are most beneficial to people. I used to publish a magazine. I couldn't do that on my own, so we stopped that. We used to run these afterlife discussion groups, but especially when COVID came about, that wasn't happening anymore. So we eliminated certain things, but we're holding more grief retreats. We're doing webinars and engaged in different research projects and
Signs of Life Radio
we
weekly
have the
too?
radio show
Right.
every week, and
Yes.
we've been doing it since 2005, and all the shows are archived going,
Wow. Wow.
back to 2005. So if people read a book, like you mentioned before, David Kessler, just
Mm.
I've interviewed him. Just you plug in, Kessler, and he'll come up, and the show will be there. So people can use that as a resource. But I think that um, I mean, Fran mentioned to me that she thought the most important work was the grief retreat. So we hold 4 of them a year. Unfortunately, they sell out very
Mm.
quickly, and we limit them to 50 or so people. So they're very small because it needs to be, because it's an intimate experience. So I feel bad that every retreat there's 150 people that are on the waiting list that want to get in that
Mm.
can't. But there's just so
So
much.
many, so much. Yeah.
Yeah.
My last question for you is I wanted to just ask about Fran. And I know before I knew you, I don't know if you know this, but Fran and I corresponded years ago, through, messaging, and we were friends on Facebook. And I just thought she was just wonderful. I always had the world of respect for her. What, for viewers, listening, like what do you view Fran's legacy as and her impact on you, at least at the foundation? And kind of like where she would see it now today. It's boomed on. I know she was in the documentary with you, but seeing how it's changed today with surviving death and like where's her legacy and would you say in her impact and like what's her kind of viewpoints that you've kind of think today?
Yeah, well, Fran was a force of nature. I mean, she was, she believed that she was put on this earth, to educate people, and it wasn't only she championed, she was involved in politics for many, many years. She was involved reforming the education system. I mean, she was, would fight for, abuses in the pharmaceutical industry. I mean, she was just somebody that took on causes. When we first got married, she worked at a regular job for a couple of years. Those are the only years that she had made money. The rest of her life was devoted, to volunteer work. So the foundation, we were personally affected, and that's what was different. And the foundation was, as we discussed earlier, possibly her mission in life. Everything was leading, towards that. So I wonder that often, I mean, is she happy? Is she upset at what I'm doing, or am I doing something wrong? Would she, I mean, we were totally opposite. So I'm doing things slip by me because I tend to be trusting of everybody. And, sometimes people take advantage and we would balance each other. So I don't have that balance now, but I like to think that she's still watching over and kind of guiding, and probably also probably saying, "Oh, so now you're doing all this stuff."
There's a sense of humor to it, but
yeah. But yeah, so that's, I mean, I'll probably never stop doing this, but I think that her mission, became my mission. So I'm honoring her as far as I'm
right.
concerned with all this work.
You're living for her, and you're the undeniable proof of her existence with the life that you live and the continuity of it. For people who want to know more about the For Every Family Foundation or Signs of Life Radio, what's the best way to get in touch or to follow, some of your work?
Well, you can, I mean, the website for the foundation is spelled out foreverfamilyfoundation.org. It has everything on there, recommended books and the radio show and some of the disciplines of research. So that's a good starting point for people, especially people that are, people that are in grief, they just Google, we come up, and then they start seeing all these things that kind of amazing to them. There's a list of certified mediums, a description of the process, and so forth. So I think I would recommend that people just visit the site and take from it what they will. I write a personal blog on beyondthefivesenses.com. That's just really for a way of me expressing my views so my head doesn't explode. It's not connected to the foundation, but just an outlet for my writing. So other than that, those are the only two things. I would recommend that people listen to the radio show because we have 5 different formats of the show. And so some of them are discussion groups. We have one show called Mediums and Messages where people could call in and get if they're lucky enough to get through and get a mini reading with one of our certified mediums. And, we talk about grief and all sorts of subjects. So it's a good outlet for people that don't know where to turn and are just looking for something.
You guys do it all. Well, you're hearing it from Bob Ginsberg. I know he's very modest, but I see him as a tremendous luminary who has shed so much light into dark, and he just continues to just change lives, change the world, and someone that I look up to, respect, and learn from in my own way. Bob, we're about to end the program. Not going to say any last words because you're going to go on, but for the show, do you have someone's going through grief or difficulty and as someone who's experienced it at both sides of the aisle, working on the professional level and personal, is there any kind of insight that you have? Any last kind of words or kind of phrases, or I don't know?
No, I would just, recommend people to just to remain open, open to the possibilities and to experience as opposed to using your logical mind. Let your logical mind step aside and just trust your heart more so than your brain.
Trust the heart. It's beautiful. Well, Bob, we'll be in touch whenever you want. You're always welcome on the program.
Thank you.
And thank you for all you do. Thank you.
Thanks, Jake. You've been doing good work yourself.
Thank you. Wow, what an episode. Thank you for tuning in to episode 7 with Robert Ginsberg. Robert shared his incredible story of transformation from being a skeptic, and left brain to now, really a believer in this stuff. And he's also shared and shine a light that it's possible to find, an awareness of not only life after death, but to find his own life after their death. And I know it's a struggle each and every day when you lose someone, but if you're able to just take one day at a time and remember that they are still with us in our own unique way, as Robert alluded to, that could help with the grief journey. So thank you, Robert, for joining us and sharing your incredible insight, as well as the Forever Family Foundation and its continued expansion and growth. Please visit the Forever Family Foundation, and they're also on Facebook. Next week, episode 8, we're going to be having afterlife researcher Roberta Grimes from Seek Reality. She's had decades worthy of experience as an afterlife researcher. You do not want to miss this episode. She will share her incredible insight and gatherings from decades worthy of experience and research in the afterlife field. Until then, stay tuned. Please make sure you share this video, subscribe to my YouTube platform, and you could also find me on Spotify and iTunes, as well as many other platforms. So please stay continued and posted to the Wisdom Jacob's Ladder with weekly episodes each and every Wednesday with different guest interviews, as well as my own videos and insights that I'll be sharing with each of you on a regular basis. So stay tuned. Please continue to climb that inner ladder, expand your minds, expand your hearts. Let's grow, evolve, and continue to ascend the ladder together. Many blessings, love be with you, and thank you for joining us.